Chapter 14. Holly wasted no time getting down to it. When I rang the secured seal to his lab, he opened it himself with the manual key and then personally escorted me into his little briefing cubicle. There were several screens attached along the length of the conference table, each glimmering with rhythmically esoteric data. Laya was next door in an adjoining cubicle with a couple of screens of her own. She waved at me through the connecting window and flashed what I'm sure she thought was a cheerful and carefree smile. Her appearance was a considerable improvement over that morning, but the strain could not be hidden. Idly, I wondered why she would even try to hide it. "First of all," began Holly after we had sat down, "I want to apologize for being so uncommunicative this morning. I didn't mean to be so obscure. It's just that I didn't know how to express what I was feeling, and I'm sorry about it." I grinned. "And what about scaring the shit out of me after the picnic? Not that I could care less if you burned out your brains, but the least you could do is try not to spring it on me." Jack Crow crap, but just the kind of compliment that Holly adored. He flushed a little and grinned shyly and glanced down at his hands folded on the table before him. But all the boyishness was gone in the next instant as he continued. "Secondly," he resumed, "I want to assure you that I'm fine. I was not harmed by the experience, however bad it may have seemed at the time, neither physically nor mentally." He sat forward, made a steeple out of his fingers, and peered intently into my eyes. "I want to stress this, Jack. Every medico in the project has been over my numbers, and there's nothing wrong. Nothing that they can find, anyway," I amended. He looked pained. He nodded reluctantly. "Yes. Technically, yes. However, I can think of no intelligent reason why one should simply assume damage without evidence. Do you?" I shook my head in response, amazed at the stern tone his voice had briefly assumed. A real director of project tone, that. Holly seemed not to notice. "Thirdly, I want to report that the experiment was a success. Not only was it a success, but it worked better than I had hoped." I frowned. "Well, that's one way of looking at it. There is a little matter of the catatonia." He looked pained again. He started to speak, stopped, rethought. Then, "I'm getting to that, Jack, but let me take it step by step, please." "Of course," I said pleasantly. Inside, I was thinking that there is nothing spookier than having someone stress to you how sane they are after having had a fit-like seizure a few days before. What Holly did next was go over ground I already knew. Talked about how it was the magnetic drainage of the record pulses off the coil which had caused the problem in the first place. Reminded me why this prevented a screen from being used to view it. Next, he re-outlined how he had hoped that, using his own little helmet in his own mind, a commonality to the two separate brainwave patterns could be artificially and temporarily induced. He had worried that it was either an impossible scenario to attempt the commonality at all, or that too much strain would result from the two different patterns conflicting in unison. But instead, a third thing had happened. A third field had been created between his pattern and the other. It had been this third field which had provided the channel of reception. And this was a real boon, for not only did it allow him to see what was going on, but it had also allowed him to retain perspective over the process. "That's what you meant when you said you could feel him feeling his emotions?" I prompted. He nodded vigorously. "Exactly. It gave me the immersion I wanted, but it also kept me a step back, prevented the possibility of psychological conflict." "Something conflicted," I pointed out. He smiled wanly. "Well, yes. There was a conflict of sorts, but not the kind that you and Laya had feared. It was not a conflict of psyche." "Then of what?" of intensity. He leaned back in his chair and sighed, spreading his hands on the tabletop. It was simply too strong, even with the sense of detachment. Not that I felt I was being sucked in or anything, he was quick to add. It's just that the emanations were simply too powerful. They caused an overload. I thought a minute. Couldn't you simply turn it down? He frowned, shook his head. We're on the lowest gain now. The trouble is, my helmet requires a certain minimum charge to function. I nodded. I see the problem. He nodded in return, but rather unhappily. There is one more possibility, however. And that is? He looked reluctant. Well, it could be that the intensity of the reception is not due to the charge needed to power the suit. It could be that... Well, it could be, finished Laya from the doorway, the fact that we are dealing with a very unusual man. A very unusual, highly dynamic man. She walked over and sat down in the seat next to me. In her hand was a coil tape. Battlefield conditions produce inordinate stress in anyone, but in Felix. You know what his name is? Was, yes. It was Felix, Holly amended. Was? I asked, surprised. You mean he died? Well, no wonder. No, said Holly quickly. He didn't die on me. But you think he will, I persisted. Holly's smile was grim. He nodded. I think so. In fact, he added, looking sad and very, very far away. I can't conceive of any other possibility. It was very quiet while we thought about that. Something in how Holly had said it, something about the hopeless finality of it. Eerie. I caught myself staring out the window overlooking the main lab to the black suit, propped into a sitting position alongside the main console. A menacing sight, sitting there just so. Menacing, sinister, and I tore my gaze away, shoving such thoughts roughly back into the shadows where they belonged. I cleared my throat. Well, I can see why you're stuck, Hall. Oh, we're not stuck, he jumped to add. But if you don't have any way to turn down the gain, We don't need to turn it down. There's another way to reduce the intensity. He glanced quickly at Laya, who met his gaze briefly, then looked away. A way to have it, in fact. What's that? I asked, stepping into it. They exchanged glances again. Holly made a determined effort to sit up straight and look me in the eye. By adding another helmet and another experimenter. My mouth fell open. I closed it. So that was it. I was too stunned to do much more than nod through the following offer. That and stare back and forth between their two intent faces while they fell all over one another in their efforts to assure me that there was no reason to suspect that there would be any damage involved. Ha! There was more of the assurances, and then came the part about the great strides that could be made with such an experiment, reminding me that I had expressed interest in helping and how this would certainly be of more help than anything else I could do. Oh, yes, there was mention of payment from the extensive fleet funding. So, could I think about it tonight, and then let's talk again in the morning? I said I would think about it. Holly couldn't let it be. He talked about how he thought he had hit on something terribly important, something he couldn't explain altogether, but something I would certainly understand when, that is, if I decided to take part, and how he would especially like to have me, and only me, in on this, how he'd like to keep this experiment just among the three of us rather than involve others from the project. Then more assurances. I said I would think about it. Laia insisted on walking me to the seal. Still more assurances to start. Then, Honeybull. The tone of voice with its quiet intensity, its brave conviction, and that look of, "Oh, I know I can trust you, Jack. You're so strong. Where else can we turn?" Complete with the soft pressure of her hand on the crook of my arm and, incredibly, batting eyelashes. It was exactly the same thing she had used so effectively on me the day of the picnic. Except then she had believed it. She had known what she was doing was right, had known her concern for Holly was justified, had known my warmth for him was genuine and appropriate to call upon. She had known she was doing the right thing. Further, she had known that what she was urging me to do was equally right. This time, she knew no such thing. She was lying with each and every well-chosen word. Why me? I kept thinking. Maybe it was the Jack Crow bit. Maybe she thought that I could just dive through the wiring feeds running between us and snatch Holly by the scruff of the cerebellum and haul him out of a tight spot. Or maybe she just didn't want the other project involved unsanctioned to know what a mad hatter her man had become. I said I would think on it. And I did, in a way. Once I calmed down a little with a brisk walk through the seals to my suite, once I had gotten over the urge to slap Laia's sanctimonious, holier-than-lesser sacrifice all for my man face. How dare that bitch screw up my head? I had experimented with the hallucinogens decades before, alongside the rest of my once contemporaries. Luckier than most on account of not really ever believing that this mental masturbation was the way, or the path, or whatever else they were calling it at the time. Seeing it, knowing instinctively that it was a brain teaser and nothing more. A trip for people who couldn't afford to travel. But even with that to back me up, there had been a time or two. So, I knew better. Life was tough enough. Climbing down into that hole with Holly and his tubes wasn't the same as the rushing chemical thrill. And maybe, well, probably if Holly felt so, there was something of great scientific value to be found. But it was that same hole, no matter how I got there. The hole where the creature lives, the monster, the fiend who comes terrifyingly quick, slipping up at you out of the muck, grinding its teeth, popping its jaws eagerly, clawing at your clean flesh with gnarled hands sporting gritty black talons, and using your face to know where it hurts the most. Bullshit. And for somebody else to boot. A risk for another means sacrifice for another. And even if I wanted to, which I sure did not, where was I gonna fit in? Too many risks already, wedged tight, and the jamming of it all still coming up. Madness! Cortez was nowhere in sight when I reached the suite. By now I knew what that meant. From the bedroom I could hear the faint hum of the fresher. Her clothing, crew jumpsuit, boots, and things were piled in the corner of one of 4 chairs surrounding a small table. On the table itself sat her view screen. I wandered over to it, idly wondering what she read. A bit fretful, too, of finding something else I might have to live up to. The screen was off, but the tab was on, the reference sequence glowing softly and efficiently in red. I cringed. Fleet IDs are 15-digit numbers, and I had only seen this one once before. I hesitated, then pushed restart and found myself staring at the official fleet dossier of one John Jacob Jack Crow. I blinked, stared, stood there, trembling. I felt invaded. I hadn't heard the humming of the fresher stop. Her voice from the bathroom door whirled me around. I had to know. she said, in a small, apologetic voice. She leaned against the seal jamb as if for support, idly wiping at the remaining flakes with a towel. Had to know what? I growled, my voice hoarse. I had to be sure, she whispered intently, pleading. Sure of what? That you go through with it. Through with what? I began. And then, of course, I knew what she meant, as I remembered what we both remembered. I knew, as I saw the tears swell and sink and slide down that horrible purple bruise beneath her eye. I ordered food for two to be delivered to the outer room. We waited in silence until we heard it arrive. I went out to fetch it, blazing down Cortez's questioning look with a glance. I brought it back into the bedroom, wheeling the trolley up to the edge of the bed where she still sat, wrapped in the towel. I pulled up a chair for me. And we ate. For close to 3 hours, we ate. Usually there was far too much food brought to me, but not that night. I stuffed myself. Karen stuffed herself. We stopped. I smoked. She drank wine or simply toyed with the stem of the goblet. Then we ate some more. Ravenously. Almost desperately. Until we could not take another bite. Then we stopped. Until we could. And always in silence. Music? She asked once, and I nodded, stood up, and keyed something neutral. It was the only word spoken between us the entire time. The music was a good idea. It gave us something to almost do while we sat between feasts. Sometimes we looked at each other. Not often. Over 2.5 hours later, it was gone. Choked and still hungry, drunk and still thirsty. I stood up slowly, my head reeling with the wine, and went into the bathroom. There was nothing else to do. The feast was over. I stayed in there a long time. Too long, really, to be healthy. I felt skinned when I came out, but that wasn't so bad either. I didn't know if she would still be there or not. Didn't know what it meant either way. She was there, under the covers. Her hair was spread like dawn across the pillows. I noticed the music was gone and the lights were dim. My cigarettes had been placed on the bedside console. I got in beside her. She slid toward me, tucking in. After a while, perplexed by my inability to feel where my skin left off and hers began, I became a louse. Said something idiotic and provocative about seeing her dossier. Her answer was to lift her head and rest her chin on my chest and peer at me until I was forced to meet her gaze. Then she said, "I'll tell you anything you want to know." It was not a qualification. It was not offensive or evasive or in any way devious. I knew that. I knew it. But... All right, goddammit. Tell me about it, I dared, lighting a cigarette. And so she did tell me about it. All about it. I lay looking at the ceiling and seeing the pictures formed by her words and by the way the small of her back shuddered beneath my palm. Her voice was invariably gentle, timid sometimes matter-of-fact. There was bitterness, too, of course, and sadness, and regret, and wicked touches of irony. but never laughter. Not once that a rich kid, happy little girl wearing pinks and blues and whites because those were the favorite colors of her daddy. She wore black for the first time at 12, at his funeral. The vacuum time. No brothers or sisters, only mother, who cried and drank in rooms with the lights out. Hope and a stepfather at 13. Raped at 14. No trial. Divorce instead. They moved again. A short remarriage. A long second divorce. Spectacularly beautiful at 16. A first fiancé. Another. 2 more. At 17 and 1/2, a husband. Mentally unbalanced. An exceptionally generous description. Long separation burdened by guilt, but tinged throughout as well by brief flashes of genuine terror. Divorce, at last, followed on cue and, as advertised, by the tragedy, sick and loathsome and out of her hands, but still, his funeral, left to her by his family, who begged and pleaded and then used her symbolic resumption of the role as an excuse to blame and accuse. Finishing school near the top of her class. Never any trouble there at any time, for she is bright and curious and somehow inherently hopeful. Joining Fleet a month later. A month after that, still in boot camp. Raped a second time. Trial serves to both exonerate him and brand her as an angel-haired slut. A blatant lie, but a common fantasy in the courtroom. Powerful military type crossing wires to get her transferred their way. When the last string is pulled, the last favor cashed, she finds herself on Capitol Earth, where she is promoted, pampered, and eventually raped again. There is no second trial. More promotions instead, and a transfer to Militar itself, hub of Fleet, corridors of power. Picking and choosing now. Not rape, not love, not enough. Her second military rapist, the general who spouted promotions, has died in the Ant War. He dies rich, dies guilty too, his will mentioning her a Fleet scandal. Karen laughs at hushed whispers and gestures just out of the corners of her eyes. She had planned to kill him someday, but this does nicely. Tense negotiations in conference rooms surrounded by leather-bound precedents, the children sitting on either side of their bewildered wooden mother, their eyes blazing hatred and envy for the luster of blonde hair and for what they assume to be the comparative richness of Karen's relationship with their cold, calculating, career-minded father. They want to kill her, but they sit still, as per lawyer's orders, for the money. Another transfer, more promotions often due to her considerable merits. She rises, always, higher and higher, feeling like two people, but the promotions are something, after all, aren't they? Tries a couple of times and nothing. Never knowing which of the two cared or could care, and if she doesn't know, the poor men, transfers away from it twice, once too soon, once far too late. But either way, gone from it. A year before trying again, too little to matter. Another promotion, though. Rising is. To her mother's deathbed. Terminal prognosis, she is told. No hope for me, says mother, adding macabrely that she had been born again. She urges baby to repent. But this sanctimonious bastard padre, who never misses a chance to touch her, however chastely, during her devotions, makes her ill. And she tells him so. Stung, he informs mother that baby's penance is as insincere as the scarlet paint of the harlot she is. Dies mother, slowly and badly, refusing to admit her sinful daughter to the end, on the advice of her priest. Over a year later, pinched with the hardness of despair, she tries again, and it almost works. His name was Leslie, and he was a lovely man who loved her dearly. In return, she felt a genuine affection. She felt a true warmth and safe. She felt safe. At the crucial moment, she told Leslie all. He ached with the jolt of her life. He wept. Also, he questioned over and over. Then he accused. Then he raged. Then denounced. Then beat her. Then he went. Soon after came another, most important promotion. Along with it came an offer to be number 2 on a fleet project, a 3-year stretch on an unknown but Earth-like place, Dr. Hollis Ware. The offer is an honor at her age, but no less than she deserved, one way or another. Still, she didn't want to go, to strand herself for 3 years where she could not rise. She put off the decision for weeks, caught between the allure of being, for once, legit, and with the tantalizing momentum of rising is. Without being aware of it, she dreamt of another choice. Then Leslie returned, providing just that. He was tearful and contrite and ashamed, but filled with protestations of hope. She knew his love for her, his heartbreaking devotion to her, was genuine. The next day, in secret, she signed with Holly. The next month, without warning, she went aloft to sanction. It was, she felt, doing the best thing for the lovely man. He was so sensitive, so easily hurt. He had brought his parents along with him to meet her. She slept, at last, on my soaked shoulder. I smoked. Sometime, in the middle of it, she had said, "I know it was all my fault. I guess I'm just no good, like Mother said." I smoked, and heard that still expecting to bleed to death from the grinding rasp of those words. I felt numbed by the vice. And then, she did an amazing thing. She stirred in her sleep and laughed. Giggled, really, like a little girl. A sweet, safe, beautiful little girl who knew only the blue of the sky and green grasses and party dresses of pink and blue and white. I reached over carefully and keyed off the last of the light. I doused my cigarette. I lay there. For hours, it seemed. I lay there, my eyes burning in the dark. The next morning, bright and early, I went down and saw Holly and did the one thing I had been so certain I would never do. I volunteered me. So bizarre.